Hello, everyone. My name is Hanar Abdulmonam, and I will be the moderator for tonight's discussion When Ethics Fail, Reproductive Justice, Structural Neglect, and the Death of Diana Aleman. Next slide, please. Great. So just a little bit of our community agreements. We just really want to make sure that we have a good discussion that raises questions. We want everyone to be just curious, respectful, challenge ideas, not people, foster an inclusive place, and really just commit to growth and reflection. And we can go ahead. Next slide, please. So again, my name is Hanar Abdulmonam, and I am the project coordinator with the Prospera Institute. I will be today's moderator, and we are joined today with Ivonne Garza, who is a senior associate at the O'Neill Institute for Health and Human Rights, and Lilly Marcelin, who is the founder of the Resilient Sisterhood Project. Thank you. So, a little bit about the Prospera Institute. It is a nonprofit organization that's based out in Boston, and it's dedicated to addressing ethical and moral challenges at the intersections of community health, culture, and society. So we'll go ahead and discuss a little bit of the case. So this is the case of Diana Aleman. She was a 27-year-old Venezuelan immigrant that was living in Peru who died after being denied timely access to reproductive health services. Her story is emblematic of the many institutional and ethical failures that occur at the intersection of gender, race, age, class, and immigration status. Her death underscores how structural violence, legal neglect, and policy inaction can result in fatal outcomes, especially for those living at the margins. This session seeks to examine the case not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a larger pattern of reproductive injustice, and to consider what ethical accountability demands in the face of systemic failure. So, with that, I will go ahead and introduce our first speaker, Ivonne Garza. So Yvonne is a senior associate with the Center for Health and Human Rights at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. Prior to joining the O'Neill Institute, Yvonne worked as a human rights specialist focusing on issues of statelessness at the reportership on the rights of migrants of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Additionally, she worked at the Center for Justice and International Law, leading America's network on nationality and statelessness, and on the strategic litigation of diverse cases at the international level. Yvonne has also done consultancy work for diverse institutions, including the United Nations Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, and has lectured classes on capacity building workshops in diverse countries of the Americas. She obtained her law degree at Facultad Libre de Derecho de Monterrey in Mexico. She holds an LLM in International Legal Studies from Georgetown University Law Center, an MA in Human Rights and Humanitarian Action with a specialty in diplomacy from Sciences, PSIA, and a master's degree in legal argumentation from University of Alicante. And with that, I will hand it off to you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Henar, and thank you to the Prospera Institute for this invitation to be a part of the discussion that we are having today on when ethics fail in the case of reproductive justice, and of course, all the case of Diana against Peru, which is currently at the international level. This case, as you said, of course, it exemplifies many of the barriers, human rights violations, and structural discrimination that many migrant and migrant women specifically face. And it is important because it sheds light into contextual and structural problems and matters that should be addressed by states in complying with their international legal obligations deriving from human rights frameworks, but also with their ethic responsibilities. And I think this case will allow us to discuss how ethics come into play, medical ethics and professional secrecy in specific, confidentiality, the principle of do no harm, how it comes into play when a migrant person seeks health services. So, in the case of Diana, I would like to start by addressing the facts of the case, sharing with our audience what this case is about. So, in the year of July of 2020, Diana, a migrant Venezuelan woman in Peru, started to have some pain in her abdomen. And so, together with her partner, she seeked, she went and consulted in a health center. Went to an appointment to see what was going on. And in the health center, they told her that she was pregnant and that the pain was due to a spontaneous abortion that she was undergoing, and that she needed to seek emergency health services and care at a hospital. Uh, that health center was close to where they lived, both Diana and her partner. And so they seeked, after they learned this, she didn't know that she was pregnant. She constantly had irregular periods of menstruation, so she was not aware that she was pregnant. And she went with her partner to a hospital. And the first barriers and the first important facts of this case is that when she arrived in the hospital, it was a public hospital. The Diana faced multiple challenges to access those services. First, she was denied entry to the hospital and entry to access to those services if she did not provide guarantee of payment and purchase of some medical equipment. Why? Because since she was a migrant woman and she did not have insurance, the hospital would not allow her into the services if she could not provide those payments. So she had to first collect the payment, provide that guarantee of payment, and purchase that medical equipment in a nearby pharmacy, and then came back to the hospital. And once she provided those, um, she was accepted into care. So the first barriers she faced was um, a challenge to her access to services due to being one, a woman, two, a migrant, and three, poor, right? Because she didn't have insurance nor a guarantee of that payment, of her capacity to pay for the services. After receiving the care, she received a threat uh, by being informed that authorities in the hospital were going to report her to the Serenazgo, the police in Peru, because she was undergoing an abortion. And this is important because abortion in Peru is completely criminalized in the criminal code, except for when there is a risk to the life of the person or to permanent damage of life. And so this criminalization of abortion is paired with a report duty that is set in the general health law in Peru, which indicates that all circumstances with regards to abortion should be reported by medical personnel to the corresponding authorities. So, this legal framework, which criminalizes abortion, was also another barrier that she has to face because confronting the spontaneous abortion that she was undergoing and without an assessment on of it was a spontaneous abortion, but the health none of the authorities in Peru ever made an assessment of the facts regarding the abortion, but she was still threatened to be reported to the police. And of course, being a woman, being a migrant, being poor, and being in a situation in Peru of irregular migration, she was threatened to face immigration enforcement. Immigration enforcement within the hospital in where she was in receiving care. She sought help with her family members. She sent a message to her family. That message was not received by her family until some hours later, the day after. And in her um, experience of this threat, and in her justified fear of the consequences she was going to have if reported to the police, not only migration consequences but potential criminal consequences, she seek to escape the situation, and unfortunately went through a window, fell, and very unfortunately died as a consequence of this. So in this case, we see how the experience of accessing health services in this scenario of intersectional discrimination, where first she was denied entry to a hospital and access to services if she couldn't comply with conditions that were only enforced because she was a migrant, because she was poor, and because she lacked insurance, um, which would, in other circumstances, would have not been required by the hospital. It started like a scenario where she also faced the obstetric violence and institutional violence. Why? Because even in the face of an obstetric emergency that she was experiencing, the hospital requested all these things to provide that care, and then the health professionals and the authorities at the hospital threatened with reporting her to state authorities and migration authorities. And this, of course, placed her in a scenario where many gender stereotypes came into play, and where her treatment was not upheld to a treatment that was fair, that was non-discriminatory, and that was adhered to, of course, the highest standard of health set by international human rights frameworks. This intersectional discrimination is exemplified by these characteristics that I explained in the facts of the case, but also in the denial of justice. So what happened was that in 2020, after this happened, an investigation started that went through 2021. In that investigation of the facts, there was a continued dismissal of evidence provided by the family, including their own testimonies, messages that she has sent through online platforms. There was a dismissal, for example, of undertaking the testimony of for other persons that were receiving care in the same space where Diana was. There was, the family requested constantly to seek for the name and identify these persons and seek for their testimonies, and this was dismissed by the state authorities. So finally, in April of 2022, the Attorney General's office in Peru decided to archive the case and not continue the investigation. This decision was um, framed in the sense that they concluded that Diana committed suicide, and that she was under a framework of depression and emotional vulnerability, and that this situation or framework of emotional distress and vulnerability and depression derived in her conduct and in her voluntary act, and her death. That was a consideration of of archiving the case in 2022. This basically was challenged by the family, arguing all the gender stereotypes that were contained in this consideration of the case, because by dismissing other evidence and by arriving to this conclusion, basically the decision was justified in two stereotypes. One, that uh, women always want to hold a role in society in which they desire to be mothers, and that abortion impedes that social role, and that if the abortion, they assumed it was provoked or not, that was never assessed in the case, in case it was provoked, there she would have experienced severe guilt because conduct against this natural mother instinct that women have. So these two gender stereotypes basically contributed to the assessment that there was no other possibility but the only one that Diana committed suicide, right? This the appeals that the family did of this decision to archive the case was upheld in June of 2022, in which the authority of that resolved this appeal, this challenge, reiterated that argument and conclusion, and dismissed obstetric violence from having a place in the facts of the case. This second decision was again appealed by the family, and in August 10 of 2022, the third authority to review the case confirmed this evaluation of the case and sustaining that Diana had committed suicide. So, of course, that justice area of the case was also lacking, was packed and full of gender stereotyping and assumptions. It lacked due diligence because many evidence and proof offered by the family were not considered and dismissed. And the Attorney General's office also did not seek to attain crucial evidence for the case that was constantly requested by the family. And in addition to that, there was also a lack of consideration to the chilling effect that a legal framework that criminalizes abortion and migration can have in cases like the one of Diana, where people might be deterred of seeking medical attention uh, due to fear of facing immigration enforcement consequences, right, in the place where they are in. So, how does ethic and human rights framework have a role in this case? From what you can see from what I have shared, there's ethical principles that are very important. The first one, the primum non cere, the do no harm, which basically upholds the non-maleficence and beneficence principles, but as well it holds the confidentiality rule. So, in cases where migrant people, whether documented or undocumented, are seeking health services, the reporting part of the actions of health clinics, health centers, hospitals, and health personnel acts, the reporting acts with regards to migration status or other migration information is not justified. Why? Because under this non-manifestance rule, uh, health clinics and health personnel and these acts would demand the recognition of the risk that documenting such information and reporting it would entail for patients, right, seeking those health services. And in addition to that, there is an ethical responsibility on handling this information in case where it is documented. So there should be a very high standard of treatment of this information and guarantees and protocols in place to ensure confidentiality in cases in which hospitals and clinics decide uh, or are requested to gather this information. Now, a second principle is autonomy. The principle of autonomy in ethical rules um, entails that both patients and caregivers must be able to exercise their rights when responding to health inquiries. And even if we know that health clinics, hospitals, health personnel might be required to inquire on migration information, the truth is that based on the principle of autonomy, a patient and persons are eligible to choose whether they want to answer or not those questions. So care facilities and healthcare scenarios should respect this autonomy principle by allowing that choice to happen. That means that whether they inquire or not, patients and caregivers must have the choice and this autonomy to actually decide whether they want to provide that information or not, just as they do in accepting or declining a medical intervention or treatment. So this principle also has a role in the choice, right? And this, of course, was not in place in the case of Diana. And of course, when talking about confidentiality and non-maleficence and not reporting, the threat that she faced also presented a vulneration of this ethical rule. And finally, justice, which mandates fair treatment and non-discrimination in medical care, means that healthcare settings must ensure protection, um, and the assessment of risks that can be faced by migrants in a healthcare setting. So not only does it demand or does it mandate that healthcare services and medical attention should be granted to persons without discrimination, but also that there should be protection protocols and settings, protective settings, so that persons can actually enjoy those medical services without discrimination. And that means that um, this principle would entail that those risks that persons could face of being discriminated against or facing unfair treatment should be mitigated, so that this chilling effect or deterrent effect that, of course, when all of these scenarios are in place, are non-effective, and that actually people can access care. The human rights framework, of course, is in line with this principle. Both the area of health law and migration law uh, in human rights frameworks since the Universal Declaration, and as well in the international covenants for economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as um, the international covenant for economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the convention on the elimination of forms of discrimination against women, together with the covenant on migrant workers and their families, and more recently the Inter-American Principles and the Rabat Declaration, etc., set up a framework where um, migrants have access to health rights equally with non-discrimination. Universal health coverage should be provided by states, and migrants uphold rights of being cared in their privacy, in the right to privacy and the right to confidentiality. The Inter-American Principles even go further to say that healthcare facilities should ensure that no information with regards to migration is provided to migration authorities, so that the enjoyment of the right to health is um, fully granted and guaranteed. But also the principle of non-refoulement, like a person shouldn't be deported if their health is at risk, for example, is in place in migration law, in asylum law. Um, it's a standard that is a standard of customary law, and also the enjoyment of sexual and reproductive health rights. And that has been reiterated by the CEDAW Committee, by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, by CMW, the Committee on Migrant Workers and Their Families, uh, and multiple international and regional bodies like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Inter-American Court in the case of Velez Lora against Panama, where they also said that health conditions should be upheld. So there's a human rights framework that speaks directly to these ethics principles and why they were compromised in the case of Diana, and the way in which they were clearly not followed by health professionals, unfortunately sheds light into the many challenges that migrant persons face when accessing health services in the countries where they are in, that is not their countries of origin, many times in situations of irregular migration, where they are undocumented or they don't have a protection status granted by law. So these ethical rules allow us to have a critical viewpoint of the case, of these challenges, and how we can address them, so that no other person has to face the difficult circumstances that Diana faced, and that they can enjoy full health access to health services and emergency services, and that their families can also uphold or access that treatment and do not face the consequences that the family of Diana is currently living, right? A situation where unfortunately her life was lost, and there's many consequences to the family as well. So I think we will discuss more, but in this case, us, the Institute, we are advocating and representing Diana and making, shedding a voice into these vulnerations of her rights, the right to health, the right to access and remedy and medical treatment for obstetric emergencies, and the correct um, compliance of not only health authorities but justice and health executive authorities in complying with their international law obligations, and of course ethical rules. And I hope that this is a good introduction and we can continue after discussing more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, for offering your insight as well as your expertise on this case. So we will have our next speaker, which is Lilly Marcelin. She is a community activist and organizer who has dedicated herself to a lifelong journey and around racial and social justice equity. Ms. Marcelin has worked on a broad range of issues from gender-based violence, human trafficking, health and socioeconomic disparities to women's reproductive health and rights. She is the founder and executive director of the Resilient Sisterhood Project, with a mission to inform and empower women and young adults of African descent about the common diseases of the reproductive system that disproportionately affect them. Ms. Marcelin strongly prefers to work in partnership with, rather than on behalf of, Black women to address deeply rooted systemic racism. Ms. Marcelin holds educational degrees from Wellesley College, Tufts University, and Boston University School of Management. So with that, I will hand it off to Lilly.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation. I apologize for being late. I'm dealing with a case of vertigo, but I'm feeling a little bit better now. Thank you so much, Yvonne, also for sharing this really important and critical case with us. But a little bit about the Resilient Sisterhood Project is this is an organization I started in 12 years ago, and before starting it, I spent 3 years listening and speaking to women who, at first, I suspected were dealing with reproductive health issues, and I won't go into the details, but the invitation in asking women, many of these women to speak with me really turned out to be a 3-year project. And in hearing about, their plight and the struggles that they disclosed to me about dealing with diseases such as fibroids, endometriosis, PCOS, infertility, gynecologic cancers, and some of them also raised issues about their young daughters or nieces, granddaughters going through early puberty and even precocious puberty, and as well as issues around maternal health and menopause. And they kept encouraging me to start an organization. I have to say, I was really reluctant about starting a nonprofit with no funding. But what really one major driving force that really led me to start the organization was a case that prior to starting the organization, I was working, I had different jobs, and I had a case of a Haitian woman who had to go into hiding from immigration. And I'll quickly get back to the slides, um, who was hiding from immigration. And about 2 months after going into hiding, her cousin called me to say that there's a lump growing into her left breast. And when I talked to her, she told me that, yes, it was the case. And right away, I said, well, you probably want to be checked by the healthcare provider. And she said, no, no, I will not go because immigration, someone might turn me into immigration. And 3, 4, 5 months went by. The lump was growing bigger and bigger. His cousin would call and be really, really distress, and I was feeling distress, and I really felt it was important to respect the fear and the autonomy of this woman about not wanting to seek care. I don't think it's because she did not care about her well-being or wanted to lose her life, going what she was experiencing, and she was separated from her 5 young children who ended up being spread to different family members. 8 months went by, and I really could not convince her to go to get help. And perhaps eventually we'll get to how I really managed to convince her to seek medical care. And luckily she did. And it turned out that it was the lump turned out to be a cyst, but this cyst was the doctor said that it caught her on time because it was becoming infectious, and the cyst could have this um, it erupted, and her body could have gone into sepsis, and she probably could have lost her life. And that incident really kept me awake for nights, and I felt really overwhelmed. But I think it was after that major incident. There were many things that I heard, many stories that were told to me, but that incident really led me to starting the Resilient Sisterhood Project. Because oftentimes people usually ask me, why did I start the Resilient Sisterhood Project? But from that incident and from the conversations that I had with many of these women, that kind of led to the mission statement that Hinar mentioned earlier, but also our visions and goals about, being informed. I was able to start the organization by being informed with women who had, the lived experiences of dealing with these reproductive health issues and the social determinants of health that they also had to face in order to navigate those health issues. But I also realized the power of being able to organize as women, to really bring things to the surface, to organize and to try to make changes. And I also realized that starting the organization and being informed by these women, having women talking to me was not going to be enough. That, clearly there are so many layers to the reproductive health issues and rights that this one we're facing, that forming alliances were going to be really important in order to do the work, because clearly not even the most well-resourced organization or institutions should not claim the banner that they can solve all the problems, that they really know it also. Clearly to do the address the complexities of women's rights, immigration rights, reproductive health, and structural racism, obstetrics racism, medical racism, and so on and so forth, that clearly we really need to have alliances in order to promote, better dialogue and to really bring to attention, the reproductive health issues and crises that so many women face, whether they are born here or whether we come here as immigrants, in order to have better positive health outcomes. So I don't know whether I sent any more slides, but I wanted to keep it brief. And so we, at the Resilient Sisterhood Project, we have 6 core programs. We have our community and outreach education, the Sisterhood Empowerment Circle. We have our environmental justice and reproductive health program, art and reproductive justice, and incarceration and reproductive health, as well as reproductive health and immigration.
All right. Thank you so much, Lily, for offering your insight as well. So for our next section of the talk, we will have a semi-structured Q&A, as well as the opportunity for anyone to go ahead and ask their questions. So our first set of questions will be for Yvonne. So our first question is, from your legal and human rights background, what do you see as the key structural failures that contributed to Diana's death? And a follow-up question to that is, how does this case reflect patterns that you've observed across Latin America?
Thank you so much, Anar, for this question. So, what are some of the key structural failures that contributed to Diana's death? Because, as I have explained, both ethical and international legal frameworks uphold obligations to guarantee the rights that were vulnerated in her case. I think the first key structural failure was a legal framework that criminalizes both abortion um, and the legal framework duty to report upheld on medical personnel. That legal framework enables a circle where a circle that establishes barriers to access health services and obstetric services specifically, and also a legal framework, but not so much the legal framework, but rather stereotypes, both around abortion and migration. So when there is strong criminalization of migration in society, right, like it is the case in Peru, where Venezuelans, especially after a very rapid trend and growing trend of migration to Peru from Venezuela, in those years in which the facts of this case took place, a criminalization against Venezuelans grew a lot in the country, so that social perception and criminalization of migration also affects and becomes a barrier and a structural failure to the case, because they face the provision of services that should be provided by the state with a lens of discrimination. That's what happens when migrants come and seek health services. The other structural failure is a lack of a system that provides access guaranteed without discrimination, but that also provides integral health services. Not only, for example, in this case, the services she required from the obstetric emergency perspective, but also from the mental health perspective, right? That would allow her to have an integral medical care, and that would have allowed for the prevention of the facts of the case. And a medical service that is an integral one and that looks comprehensively into the person, right? And the other thing is the lack of justice systems that function appropriately without prejudices and stereotypes. So the the case of Diana sheds light into a failure in the judicial system and in the prosecution of the case, the investigation of the case, where the case lacked at all due diligence. It lacked cooperation from authorities. The family was not able to obtain justice because it was not even initiated. So it is important to have institutions and judicial justice systems that operate in benefit and that will have and uphold those minimum rules of the judicial process, like due diligence and cooperation, right, to finding all the facts that are relevant in the case. And this case was archived basically, so it didn't even have a chance. And of course, then the failure to repair. So there's a huge impact of what cases like the one of Diana has for collectively as a society, but also individually and for the family. And so the lack of access to both health services, but to also a justice system, um, derived in a failure to repair for the violations that took place in the life of Diana, but also in her family members. So that's some of the structural failures that I see from the legal and human rights background. And patterns across Latin America, unfortunately, the case of Diana is not the only one. We see cross continent denial of access to health for migrants some countries have a differentiation in access to public health services based on nationality, where there's a treatment for nationals and a treatment for non-nationals, and some others do not uphold those differences but have barriers when migrants who are even in regular or irregular status seek health services. And some of those are similar to the ones that Diana faced. Access, economic access, the possibility of paying for those services, and then of course the perception, stigmatization, and stereotypes that come into play in the provision of those services by health personnel, healthcare staff. There's no health coverage, universal health coverage for people who are in countries. That's also something we see and something that we still need to work on. And in many cases, the lack of confidentiality, of the guarantee of the right to confidentiality and professional secrecy is also vulnerated and violated. And that one case is in El Salvador, where the legal framework also establishes the duty to report for health personnel, and that derives in many cases that are similar to the case of Diana, where hospitals report to other state authorities of abortion situations. And also, and that derives, of course, in the criminalization of women who have to access obstetric emergency healthcare and reproductive health services. And that, of course, deters many women, not only migrant women, but also nationals, from accessing those services that should be in place to ensure the health of all women and girls in the country. But we also see similar trends in the DR, in the Dominican Republic, where pregnant women are detained in hospitals as they seek obstetric care, and many times they are in labor, and they are detained and then immediately deported when they are in need of healthcare services, and that's widely known and reported in the news. So there are many other circumstances in Latin America when we observe similar situations, and that just reinforces the fact that, one, the health sector must be more in close with the migration sector. Both the legal and ethical worlds should speak to each other more to bridge in those gaps of when health personnel lack knowledge or information about migration information they should be aware of, in order to provide integral health services that uphold ethical standards of justice, of non-maleficency and benefit, and also of autonomy, right? If health personnel had more information, that would be good for them to know where the responsibilities are and how they could provide more integral and encompassing equal health services. But also the migration sector needs to know more about how health services should be provided, and they can accompany better people who are in need of those health services. So I think that bridging those gaps and playing a role in sharing, in knowledge sharing and information sharing, can allow us to have better systems in place that will, for hopefully, prevent other cases from happening, or other cases like the one of Diana from taking place.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. And then our next set of questions will be for Lilly. So, in your work with Afro Latinx and Black communities in Boston, how do the same power dynamics around age, gender, and race impact access to care and bodily autonomy? And how do we build frameworks that prioritize community knowledge and lived experience?
Sorry, I was muted. I apologize for that. I think it's the same power dynamics I think are pretty much at play here in this country in our work with Black women of African descent, whether they identify as Afro-Latinx or whatever the ethnicity is. I think it's a power dynamic that constantly undermines bodily autonomy and which renders people sicker even before they're even seek medical care. Because if we think about in the case of Diana, how she knew that she was not going to receive the care that she needed to receive. She also knew that with the pregnancy, I think I suspect that she suffered from a miscarriage, right? Am I right, Yvonne?
Yes, it was an
It was
spontaneous abortion. Yeah.
it was a miscarriage,
Yeah.
and miscarriages, many pregnancies can result in miscarriages. So when suddenly you have practically men, making mixing laws with the medical system and trying to exercise, their rules, trying to impose, their policies upon, women's bodies, upon the medical health issues. That's a recipe for disaster. So Diane's case can be similar to many cases that I know that we see here, where you have women who are already marginalized, coming from marginalized populations who have long borne the brunt of health gaps, not having access to the appropriate healthcare services or health practitioners now are being punished for for something that they don't have any control over. And I think what it's also doing, it's creating a lot of fear in women for seeking care and really creating a form of segregation because women are just are and will be afraid to really seek, life-saving care that they need. Because when you suffer a miscarriage, you should not be thinking about what are the legal ramifications. You want to find yourself seeking medical care and receive the appropriate care rather than thinking that, am I going to be criminalized? So uh, I feel that, in thinking about, a human rights framework and ethical standards, it's really important, for the legal system, the medical system to recognize that healthcare is, the healthcare is already so limited, in marginalized group, and that the access is really crucial. So by not having that access, it's only going to exacerbate, women's reproductive health, women's reproductive rights, exposing them to more all kinds of harm to themselves, to their babies, but also to their society. So access to reproductive health, access to reproductive rights is a public good. It is a human right. So I think women being able to have just free rights, free determination about the rights to their body and the rights to seek medical care without being punished. I think is really crucial, but certainly the same dynamic is definitely at play. I think about the example that I gave about this woman that I was helping and who went into immigration and was hiding and we were not sure whether she had a malignant tumor. We didn't know really what was happening. It took about 8 months to convince her to come out of hiding and to seek the care that she needed to get. That was in 2007. Here we are 18 years later, back in the same situation. But I often think about her case and I wonder, would I be able to even dare encourage her to come out of hiding, to seek the reproductive health care that she really needed? I'm not sure whether I could take that chance.
Yeah, I completely agree, Lily. It's a very difficult situation to be in, but thank you so much for offering your insight as well. So now we are going to open it up to the audience for the Q&A portion. And I do see that we received two questions. So I'll go ahead and read out the first one. And either Lily or Yvonne, whoever wants to answer it, just please feel free to unmute yourself and go for it. So, first question is, why is it important for us to make comprehensive ethical arguments when it comes to medical care instead of just moral arguments? Different cultures have different morals, but reinforcing a universal standard for human rights, we can all raise the collective health care for all people, immigrant or not. So how can having an effective and ethical healthcare standards benefit people regardless of immigration status?
I don't know, Lily, if you want to go.
But please go on. You can answer that.
Okay.
Please feel
But
free.
well, the first thing, and I thank you, George Angel, for your question. The first thing that comes to mind is I certainly 100% agree that upholding and reinforcing universal standard for human rights allows for a better enjoyment and comprehensive ethical arguments, but a better universal enjoyment of healthcare standards for anyone. And it doesn't mean specifically, of course, the case we're discussing today has a migration prong, but the benefit of upholding human rights encompasses any perspective and any nationality, and this disregarding any type of migration status. So I am thinking with your question specifically about the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, established in General Comment 12, the specifics of the highest attainable standard of health. And they say that this highest attainable standard encompasses four elements. First, accessibility. Second, availability of health services, acceptability, and quality. And I think that if we uphold that standard, we allow for any sort of healthcare to be provided into that highest standard of health, because it will be accessible for free, for without discrimination. It will be available. It means that there would be facilities that could be open and offering those services to people. It would be acceptable, which means that it would take in consideration the integral perspective of the patient, means whether they want to accept or not the treatment based on their beliefs, their morals, their considerations, etc. That would open a whole diagram of options, right? When acceptability comes into play in the provision of health services, that means taking into account what the patient wants to do with their autonomy. And quality, which means adhering to the highest standard of services and treatment available. And that requires the quality prong for the sharing of information between countries, for example, in context of epidemics and pandemics, where one country might be able to follow and research more, and to share that standard allows us to share um, and cross information between researchers and legal and medical and all sorts of, of professionals to attain that quality standard of health services. So I think these four elements, regardless of the moral arguments that we want to make, if we uphold to those standards, then we are all able to enjoy. We benefit all from allowing those standards to be upheld in societies, both individually and collectively. And that's, I think, what human rights standards, specifically on health, seek to achieve, right? These four elements of the highest attainable standard of health. And yeah, and when the ethical arguments come into play, then we can discuss. But I think those, as I explained with my first part of the presentation, I think that ethical standards and principles adhere to those four standards of the highest attainable standard of health, because they're not they are not obstructive of that standard, but rather they complement the idea of the principle of non-maleficence, of beneficence, of confidentiality, of better interest of the patient, and of upholding justice and accessibility and autonomy. Means that it can only, if we also act and attain those standards of ethical principles, we could just complement the notion of universal health, human rights. And I think, yeah, that's like the goal, or where we all seek to go and move forward to.
Thank you, Yvonne. And Lily, if you have anything else that you would like to add? We do also have another question from George Angel. So, how can we embrace an ethical framework that is inclusive of Indigenous medicine and spirituality? Is there a place where Indigenous medical practices can work in alignment with modern ethical standards?
I think it's a great question. It's something that I talk about quite a bit when it comes to Western medicine, versus Indigenous medicine, Eastern medicine. I would say, yes, I feel that even asking the question, how can we embrace an ethical framework? I think, Indigenous or Eastern medicine, or all kinds of ancient, deeply ancient rooted medicines that have been around way, longer than Western medicines, should be part and parcel of Western medicine, given the wisdom and the knowledge, and that they certainly bring. And I think an ethical framework should really, should come through a lens of respect as far as integrating Indigenous medicine, because I feel that in Western medicine, while there's a lot of knowledge, we have made a lot of scientific advances, but still there is still quite a bit of arrogance around the thought of Western medicine is the be all and end all, in really also creating a stratification of of uh, of what medicine practices are certainly are more sophisticated, more technologically advanced, thereby leaving and or even deriding other medicines, whether it's in Indigenous medicine or in spirituality. But I think there should be, as for those of us who do the work to advocate around addressing, structural isms. I think this is also, and for those of us who are also in the health, in healthcare, bringing that framework as part of our conversation is really important, whether we are in professional settings, whether we are in our communities, but to ensure that we are constantly uplifting the importance and the rich, deep knowledge that medicine from different groups, different race, different continents also bring, because as they have been around for a very, very, very long time and have sustained us and continue to sustain us.
And can I add something to that? Just a bit of a reflection on this second question that I think is very relevant. Something that comes into mind with regards to the notion of inclusion, right? And how can modern ethical standards encompass other ethical frameworks like Indigenous medicine and spirituality, etc. Something that comes to mind, again, thinking of acceptability and how we encompass the central role that people have in making their own choices for their bodies, like the principle of autonomy. I think, for example, a good example of where this could come into play is health directives, right? In a health directive, the patient is allowed to decide, uh, to take decision even previous to being possibly incapable of taking them, and based on what their decision would be, considering their own beliefs, religion, uh, preferences, etc. And I think that that would be in line with, for example, modern Western medicine, where health directives, if you have one, would be a critical consideration for doctors when taking decisions in critical circumstances. So I think that example of how acceptability comes into play and ethical principles come into play in respecting the choice, the autonomy component, can allow us to very easily embrace inclusiveness in the way in which health practice is I wouldn't want to say in which health practice is executed. I would say in any circumstance, because that would center the choice and the principle of autonomy aligned with the best interest of the patient, aligned with non-maleficence, etc. But that will also allow the patient to rule what they would prefer. And that's why health directives matter, right? That conversation around health directives is important. And many of us don't follow very diligently on that, but that's why it matters, because it allows that choice even when we're not able to make that choice by ourselves.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. And we received one more question. Um, we have a few more minutes, so we can just go ahead and wrap up with this question. What does ethical accountability look like in practice when dealing with these systemic failures?
Um, I think in this current climate, this is, again, a loaded, really, really important question. Um, I see accountability practically as, I feel that as where we are bearing witness, to we're bearing witness to structural violence and racism against women, women's reproductive health rights, and against just so many people. I see us bearing witness in for human rights violations, just again the lack of medical care, lack of access to mental health, even malnutrition. And I could go on and for a very long time, but as this accountability and bearing witness, my hope is that we can become more introspective, just about the deliberate tactics and policies that are causing so much harm, to women like Diana, to what happened to her in Peru, but so many women right here in this country. I think ethical failure that are really leading to life or death issues certainly really require a whole lot more commitment, from all of us in really working in partnership, working in collaborations to address the medical, the legal issues, and we certainly are seeing a landscape where, with the current administration, that does not really respect the law, that does not respect human rights. So I'm not really sure I have oops, quiet. Sorry. I have two doggies. I apologize. But I don't really, this is kind of like my perspectives, because I think there are just so many sources to this question. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. If I can complement, I think this question is also very important, like ethical accountability. How does it look in practice when confronting systemic failures from states? I think that the first thing that comes to mind, if of course, if states are serious and if we are all serious in engaging with accountability, then there must be a review and undertaking of changes that are necessary to comply with those ethical standards that we have, right? Like it means that we need to something needs to change and to comply not only with ethical standards but also with legal obligations. And I there is a toolkit that I like a lot that was recently shared in another webinar. It was developed by Dr. Altaf Sari from UCLA, and in this toolkit, they reflect a bit upon this question on how the system must look like to uphold ethical responsibilities and standards, right? So, for example, what could institutions do? And they offer three areas, like what can institutions do, what can clinics and healthcare facilities do, and what can patients do. So for example, from the institutional approach, they said it would be necessary to establish policy limits and on how to cooperate with immigration enforcing authorities, right? So there needs to be policies within institutions on how to deal with these questions. There must be a designation of public and private spaces that will allow for more clarifying and security protection on the part of patients and medical and health personnel that are in that space. There needs to be a clear uphold of confidentiality and protection of information protocols, and there should be limits to documenting migration status. They also suggest in that toolkit that there should be a designation of either an immigration focal point person within the institution or a task force that deals with that within the healthcare institution. Then from clinics, they said there must be education and training for clinicians and for health providers on how or what are their obligations with regards to immigration legal frameworks. There should be support for immigration employees. We know that in many healthcare settings, there are many migrant persons who are providing services and who are themselves employees providing those services. So there should be support for them. And also, there should be clear models for care services on how they should be provided, etc. And for patients, there's a big in this toolkit a lot of information regarding how there could be a engagement and how they can be more empowered, like patients can be more empowered to seek health services. So first is that patients should we should all contribute to the education of patients on the rights they have. And this is basic, like for example, knowing that you can decide or not to provide your migration information to a health service provider, even if they are obligated to inquire in that. But knowing that you have that right to choose is important. There also for patients a need to pursue medical collaborations where there could be more information sharing, etc., to promote affirming care messages. So a lot of training on language and how we can be inclusive in our language in providing those services, and also emergency preparedness. So sharing information so that patients can have the information they need to prepare for emergency settings where they might be in a situation to take decisions for their family members or far away from their family members, etc., or even in the midst of other immigration enforcement situations that could come up, and how they could provide services. So in the clinic models for care services, that also the toolkit includes, for example, considering how do we provide health services remotely or through mobile medical services that could allow access in remote settings, etc. So all those considerations are very important. I think they allow us to reflect on how to have accountability, but also how to build those ideal frameworks where systemic failures will have less of a chance to thrive. And I think they're very practical actions that we could all start to undertake in our practices, right? And again, this toolkit was made by Dr. Altaf Sari of UCLA, and I can happily share it with everyone. But it has proved to be a very practical resource. I find it very easy to understand, and that it allows us to reflect on this question precisely.
Thank you so much, both to you, Yvonne and Lily, for sharing all of your expertise, and for taking the time to join us as well as prepare your slides. We really, truly appreciate it. So we are at time, but we really appreciate everyone joining us today. A few things before you head out, if you all can please take the time, just a few minutes. I dropped the survey link. We'd love to get your feedback on the session, and it will help us for the upcoming Areitos Cafe sessions. And then we will also be sending out a post-event email that will have the slides, the recording, and just more information regarding the Prospera Institute as well as our speakers. So with that, thank you all so much, and we hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Thank
Thank
you
Thank
so
you.
much.
thank you,
Bye-bye.
Bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.